district. I do a number of things there. One of the things I've done over the last 10 years or so is we've always wondered, you know, we do these things, we think there's benefit to water quality, we think there's benefit to fish habitat, and Jessica actually looked at some of these things and came back with some numbers. So I just wanted to show a couple slides here of before and afters and kind of the process we've gone through on some of these plantings, and I'll hand it over to Jessica. So reed canary grass, I don't need to say anything more about that. It's reed canary grass. This is a string planting from about 10 years ago now, but this channel was all reed canary grass. You can see it down in here. I think it was just sprayed once prior to the planting. We planted 10 or 15 feet of native shrubs on either side here. The goal was to get enough shade to get the grass out of there so that this stream section wouldn't have to be dredged over and over again. But not so many plants, not such tall plants that we were adversely affecting the field very much. 2 years later, it looked like this. We achieved what we wanted, which was shade in there. You can see there's no grass in there anymore. And down inside there, this is a little different reach, but the same area. The grass is gone. The channel actually widened out a little bit. I was just telling Eric, and it deepened a little bit. Once the grass wasn't there to hold on to those sediments anymore. And along the edge of the planting, lots of diversity, really good for all the different bird species, low mammal species, and things like that. And what we ended up with on a lot of these, and we've done miles and miles of these in different places around the county, is what we've been calling a long, skinny forest, because they're only 10 or 15 feet wide, and they're as benign as you can be without, again, adversely affecting the fields very much. So that's all I have for you.
My name is Jessica Shaw again, and thanks for having me here. So I've spent the last 2 years researching narrow riparian buffers, like what Frank was talking about, and I've tailored my talk mostly to farmers. I'm going to go over different functions that are important in the agricultural area that buffers can provide, and I'm going to talk about the widths that increase their effectiveness, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit at the end about the study that I did the past 2 years. So how do buffers work in the landscape? Well, the 3 functions I'm talking about that are most important excuse me, in the ag environment are shade, nutrients, and sediments. And we want to prevent those things from getting into our waterways. So shade, why is it important? Well, what do you notice about within the 2 circles about the concentration of streams? What do you notice?
Much more dense on the right.
Yeah, so in our stream map, it's much more dense on the right. So we have a high concentration of these really narrow streams that have a tendency to warm up very quickly. And that's why it's very important to have shade over these areas, because the quantity of those streams, when you add them all up, they have a greater effect on stream warming once it gets down to the lower reaches. So in our area, this is a zoom in, and you can see all the stream maps for lowland Whatcom County. It's a little bit deceptive though. These are the natural streams and some of the, the double ditch areas. But not all of our narrow type streams, we'll say, or ag waterways are on this map. Within all our county drainage improvement districts, I want you to focus on District 21 here. It has the most ag waterways for the amount of area. So within this area, it's not shown on the map, but look at all the other streams in this area that have the potential to be warming up and draining right into the Nooksack. Within this area, there's about, combined between the constructed ditches and the modified streams, there's about 30 miles or more of waterways. That's quite a lot of waterways that can be warming up. Within the whole drainage system, there's about 330 miles, and that's just within these drainage districts. That's not counting other areas in the county. So that's why it's really important to still have shade over our narrow ditches in ag lands. So when I went through the literature, what I found was that mostly temperature in waterways is studied in timberlands. That's where a majority of the research takes place. And the type of studies that have been done were on, air temperature, where they have the in and out comparison, what I like to say. So an air sensor, temperature sensor outside, this buffered area, and one in the buffer and one over the stream. Or they compare the warming effect from an upstream location and then a downstream location, so they have an up-down design. Or they do the before-after design, which is before, they measure stream temperatures before and after they do some logging. And then what I've done is the riparian crepe buffer study design, which I like to say, which is a combination of the up-down design, but within a planted crepe buffer. So, and the vegetation characteristics are a bit different. So in the literature, what I found, my general conclusions about shade are that narrow buffers can be very effective if they're dense and provide enough shade over the waterway. So, and when I say narrow, 6 to 7 meters is about 20 feet or so, which is the long skinny buffer that Frank likes to plant. But some of these results in the literature I've found, they can vary depending on different site specific conditions. Another study found that a 30-meter buffer width that is within 10 meters over the stream bank can provide enough shade. So it really depends on site specific, but in our lowlands, the way we're planting them, I think they're doing a good job of providing that shade. And then another thing I ran into is that buffer length can be sometimes just as important as a buffer width. If you're providing that longer distance over which you're preventing the sun from warming the stream. And it provides more connectivity for fish habitat and that sort of thing. So there was one study that found about 0.2 of a mile long buffer can cool the stream up to 1 degree. And that's significant if you're a fish. So we talked about shade. Now we want to talk about nutrients. I won't belabor this. You guys are farmers. You probably know all about nitrogen and phosphorus and how it cycles. But so what the buffer is doing in this circumstance is it's acting like a sponge, and it's sort of holding some moisture in the soil there and allowing more denitrification to happen. So it's releasing that nitrogen before it can go into the soil. So I wanted to use an analogy when we were thinking about buffers and nutrients. So we have our buffer here in the stream, and we're gonna put some nutrient input into our buffer. So the buffer is sort of like this guy's stomach, and these hot dogs are sort of like the nutrients that we're putting into our buffer. This guy is like, he's like young and beautiful, he's never had heartburn a day in his life. He has an increased capacity to assimilate some of those hot dogs or nutrients into his system. So when you start loading it on, you sometimes, if you quit while you're ahead, you're gonna keep all those nutrients within your system. And you're gonna be able to digest them and be comfortable. But if you add too many to the system, you're gonna, I don't have a third or fourth picture about what happens if they don't stay in there, but you get a nutrient release into the stream. So the size of the buffer for nutrients is directly related to the amount of nutrient that you need it to absorb. And the way the studies are set up for studying the effectiveness of widths for nutrients is similar to temperature. You know, you have you're measuring concentration at the edge of the buffer, and then a concentration once it moves through the buffer near the waterway. Their effectiveness doesn't really matter what type of vegetation it is. Generally, the wider the buffer, the more nutrients it can assimilate. And that's been shown over and over and over. But there are some studies that show, you know, these narrow 5 meters or 15 feet of grassy strip and maybe 2 or 3 rows of trees can have pretty high effectiveness as well. So I pulled this from Mayer and Associates in 2007. He looked at over 50 different studies of where you have nitrogen removal effectiveness as a function of your buffer width. And so initially what we see is that in these low width, you know, below 30 meters or so, or 100 feet, you have a high variability of the effectiveness. So a lot of those site-specific conditions are playing a role in how well your buffer is performing. But up here, these black dots are nutrients flowing through the soil. You know, it's not overland runoff, it's just moving through the soil. You can still have quite a few like very effective buffers, even at these widths that are less than 30 meters. So when it comes to phosphorus, so in generally, these buffers are better at filtering out the particles that are stuck to soil coming over an overland runoff. It's a little bit harder to retain phosphorus that's in subsurface waters. But I did find a few studies that had fairly high effectiveness where it was removing 96% of the total phosphorus with just these 5 meters of grass and a few rows of trees. And that was about 10 meters or 30 feet of buffer. And just to reiterate that point, you get about 80% removal just starting at about, you know, 7 to 10 meters wide or about 20 to 30 feet. So my general conclusions about nutrients probably is a lot harder to hear for some of us, but if we want an effective buffer for nutrients, it's a lot of times a larger one will do the job more consistently than a smaller one. because the smaller buffers, even though it does have, it can have assimilative capacity when the nutrient load is low, it reaches its capacity quicker than a wider buffer might. And so you want that long-term effectiveness as well. And so we've talked about shade, nutrients, and then sediment is another big component. It gets kicked up from tilling, and it flows into the rivers from overland runoff. But why is it important? So over time, your long-term productivity of your soil is decreased when you lose that soil mass and the topsoil nutrients. And then, just to reiterate that point, here's a figure from the NRCS, a USDA study over the entire country. In the Pacific Northwest, we're about the third least erosive area on the map. And then, as you can see, over time, from 1982 to 2007, we've definitely decreased the amount of, this is tons per acre per year. So now there's only 4.8 tons per acre being lost from your field each year. And, generally, it's probably an average. So it's still an issue. And what these buffers do is they create a physical barrier to overland runoff, which you already know. This can be achieved by just a grass filter strip. It can be, fairly narrow, in fact, or grass and trees. So here's another study by Juan and his associates. In 2009, he looked, every one of these dots represents a different study where sediment trapping efficiency is a is a function of the buffer width. So what we have here is at about 10 meters, you're generally you have 80% effectiveness very consistently. But what about this section over here, where you have between 80 and 100% effectiveness at widths less than 10 meters? What's going on? And especially when we look at the average of these studies, the effectiveness average seems to start around 5 meters, which is like 15 feet or so. It's pretty narrow. That's a Frank Corey kind of buffer. So I'm going to trademark that. So what is going on? These narrow buffers do have potential to reduce the amount of sediment. So, and whenever Frank's out there helping you put in a buffer, he's taking into consideration these conditions on your land. So low slope, whether you have an even distribution of overland flow, or do you have a couple channels that migrate to the stream. Dense vegetation increases the effectiveness because you're increasing that roughness over the surface of the ground, and that prevents large particles from getting in. And then you have soil particle size. So if you have a very small soil particle, it slips through that grass and that vegetation much more easily. So what's the deal? What's the importance of all these factors combined? The shade, nutrients, prevention from going into the stream, and keeping those sediments out. Well, a lot of it, most of it has to do with salmon. We spend billions of dollars a year improving salmon habitat. So what do they need to survive? They need clear water, clean, high oxygen levels, and they need some habitat. And if you notice, look at the proportion of the size of the eye to that fish's head. It's huge, right? Like, if we had eyes in that proportion, it'd be like this big in the middle of our forehead. So they're sight predators. They absolutely need that clear water to get enough food to survive and be successful when they migrate to the ocean. So the combined factors can have this sort of like a multiplier effect, where if you have no shade, we have sun beating down, we have a little bit of nutrient coming in there, you've got this wild reed canary grass growing. When that grass starts to decompose, the bacteria that decomposes it actually uses oxygen in that process. So oxygen is taken right out of the water. And then you have high temperatures and low oxygen at the same time. Your fish in there aren't doing so well. So with that in mind, I wanted to know if we could maintain some of these physical aspects of streams that fish need with narrow buffers. So I looked at whether, one, the narrow buffers were providing enough shade over a 100-meter reach, and two, whether the water temperature within those reaches was being maintained by that level of shade. And then I also looked at 15-foot buffers, 35-foot buffers, and then I used control sites without any buffers at all. And then later I looked at fish populations to see if those fish populations would be different between buffer sites. So the study locations were all in Whatcom County, all in this lower region of the Nooksack drainage. We had sites at Scott Ditch, Elder Ditch, 4 Mile, 10 Mile, and Deer Creek. So I tried to choose sites with similar land use, so they're all dairies, and they're all fish bearing, and the buffer's vegetation was mature, so I considered that mature and able to provide enough shade at older than 5 years. So, like I said earlier, I used the up-down design and placed water temperature sensors upstream and downstream, and then I compared the relative difference in temperature between the different width of buffers. And then to kind of explain some of the differences in temperature that I might have found, I measured the vegetation as well and looked at the effective shade, an average effective shade over the entire reach. And here's a 0 buffer with 4% shade. And then I can't remember if these are 15 or 35, but I know this 90% shade is a 15-foot buffer. So they were, even the very narrowest buffers were providing pretty good shade. And then I looked at relative abundance in fish populations at all sites. So what I sort of predicted for temperature was that within these buffered areas, which is our green zone here, and then we have the stream, that I thought the temperature would decrease or either be maintained from the upper to the lower end of that reach. And then for sites with no buffer, I thought it might be the opposite, if there's a lot of sun coming in, that it would be warming. what I've seen so far, I've just looked at the 2014 data. It's kind of a mixed bag, and there are outlying factors that can be considered at the different sites. I had it both ways, where sometimes it looked exactly how I would predict. Sometimes it was a no buffer that cooled somehow from possibly tile drains or groundwater inputs. And then I had buffered reaches that were warming to some extent too. So I'm going to do some more digging and processing of that data to explain what I found for that year. For 2014, this is there are no units in this representation. This is just a physical representation of the similarity between fish communities at each different width site. So these little green dots are the 35, the yellow dots are the 15, and the blue are the no buffer. And what you would expect, if the fish communities were similar, then all the yellow dots would be grouped together in one location. And that location might be different than, say, the blue dots or the green dots. But in this case, we have totally a random splattering of study sites. So there was not, the grouping of the points was not related to buffer width. And so fish populations were random and not associated with width. Now what we found, so there are quite a few coho salmon. 11 of the sites had coho present out of the 14. So, and that's really good, because coho salmon, they rear over multiple seasons, and so they're exposed to these environmental conditions that are not so favorable, and that they're more sensitive to them. So the fact that they're still present at most of these ag sites is great. They're finding little nooks and crannies to make their living. We found prickly sculpin. These are native fish. We found those in rockier kind of areas. But in one area I found a brown bullhead catfish. This is a non-native, warm water loving species, and not necessarily good to have in our ag ditches. So we have large-scale sucker. This is a native fish. It does well in a wider range of temperature and sediment conditions. And then we had lamprey at a surprising number of sites as well. I'd say about 10 of the sites had the lampreys as they're migrating through. And of course, almost all the sites had cutthroat. And then we have bluegill, which are non-native invasive species that favors warm water conditions as well. So these guys are definitely an indicator that our water conditions are borderline. If we're finding coho and bluegill in the same area, those coho are living on the edge. They're living dangerously. And slight increases in temperature can really have an increased effect on their ability to survive there. So, just to recap what Frank said, benefits of buffers to farmers are that you'll get better drainage. They create a refuge for native pest predators, and it'll create a windbreak that reduces